There are two origins for the holiday of Mayday, related but different. One is the ancient celebration of spring, the renewal of the earth, and promise of rebirth in the seasons. The other is the assertion of workers' rights, also promising a rebirth of sorts, but in this case, the rebirth of our society on the basis of solidarity and social justice. I'll just say a few words about the first one and focus my remarks mostly on the second, since that's the labor history part of Mayday. Let us also note at the outset the contradiction between our current circumstances when we cannot gather in large crowds due to the COVID-19 virus and the action at the heart of Mayday, which is mass demonstrations of workers. The old Mayday, which is still celebrated in many places around the world, especially in Europe. Let's see if we can get a bigger screen here. Originated with a Roman pagan festival called the Floralia. It celebrated Flora, the Roman goddess of flowers, and included quite a bit of dancing, bacchanalia, and other types of sensual pleasure, as is appropriate for a holiday about fertility and procreation. Depending on the calendar used, this early May Day was a holiday associated with either spring or summer, and various versions of it appeared in different cultures. As with many pagan holidays, when Europe was becoming Christianized, May Day became contested terrain. In some places during the Middle Ages, it was incorporated into one or another Catholic saints' days. A bit later, in the 18th century, it became a feast day of Saint Joseph the Worker, husband of Mary, surrogate father to Jesus, and a carpenter. In the 19th century, May Day morphed in most places into a secular holiday marking the coming of spring. Common rituals associated with May Day included dancing around a maypole, crowning a May Queen, and giving May baskets to friends and neighbors. Each of these activities involved flowers. Good, clean fun. It was also in the 19th century that we find the beginnings of the International Workers' Holiday. As we shall see, that May Day has, for more than a century and a half, been associated with a few key concepts and serves as a measure of ever-changing relationships in the balance of power between workers and the capitalist class. By way of introduction to that May Day, let me tell you about a recent experience of mine when I was asked to give testimony in Sacramento on a bill supported by the California Federation of Teachers, AB 3042, which was introduced in 2018 into the legislature by Assemblyman Miguel Santiago. Santiago and I appeared before the Assembly Ed Committee. Santiago briefly described his bill, which designated May 1st as a school holiday to be known as International Workers' Day. He noted that the month of May is already officially Labor History Month in California. AB 3042 specifically called for schools to teach about the history of May Day as well as making May 1st a holiday. Santiago introduced me, and here's part of what I said to the Assembly members. May Day, or International Workers' Day, celebrates the birth of the movement for the 8-hour workday, a seemingly impossible goal in the 19th century when 10 and even 12-hour days were common, 6 and sometimes 7 days a week. It would right an historic injustice for the holiday to finally be celebrated officially somewhere here in the USA. That's because this country is where the events occurred, strikes and demonstrations by a largely immigrant workforce in the 1880s, that began the movement for the 8-hour day, which was only crowned with success 50 years later with passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act. Today, when labor and immigrant rights are under attack, above all by the President of the United States, California can lead the way to a positive educational alternative to these anti-worker, anti-immigrant policies by bringing this holiday home. When I finished my testimony, there was a little moment of silence. None of the Assembly members were saying anything. This is, of course, unusual for elected officials. I thought I knew what the problem was. During the Cold War, each year on May Day, the Soviet Union would hold a giant military parade in Moscow. A picture like this, not workers peacefully demonstrating, which is what they typically do around the rest of the world, was usually featured on the news that evening. I guessed this picture was the one in the minds of these Assembly members. Finally, one said to Santiago, "I don't understand. We already have Labor Day in September. Why do we need International Workers' Day on May 1st? What's the difference?" Santiago said, Labor Day is for workers in the United States. Mayday is for all workers everywhere. The bill made it out of committee and then died on the assembly floor, and that was the last we heard of it. But the question that the assemblyman asked, why do we need a May Day holiday, involves more than the simple answer given by Santiago. It involves looking at the history behind how May Day became a workers' holiday practically everywhere in the world outside the USA. We need to look specifically at the events of 1886, but the roots of the struggle go back even further. In the early 19th century, as the United States began to industrialize, there were conflicts between workers and their employers over how many hours should make up the proper length of the workday. At least as much as the rate of pay or safe working conditions in dangerous workplaces, a desire to reduce the hours of work was behind worker discontent. Most workers at the time were expected to be on the job for 10, 12, and sometimes more hours a day, and the work week was usually 6 days, not 5. That's the historical reality beneath the bumper sticker you might have seen that says, "Unions, the folks that brought you the weekend." There were no worker protection laws like those we have today regulating the workplace during the Gilded Age. Most labor laws tended to be anti-worker, and unions were generally considered by the courts to be unlawful conspiracies against the God-given rights of bosses to do whatever they wanted. As George Baer, president of the Reading Railroad, put it, "The rights of the laboring man will be protected and cared for, not by the labor agitator, but by the Christian men to whom God has given control of the property interests in this country." For workers, things looked a little different. They understood that every extra hour on the job was an hour they didn't spend time with family, friends, pursuing self-improvement, having fun, or sleeping. They felt that the length of the workday should be a matter of negotiation, not dictatorship. To assist their efforts, they formed unions and political parties. Although most high school history textbooks don't mention the fact, the first unions were built by workers in the 1790s, and by the 1820s, they had founded working men's parties. One of the key demands of these organizations was a shorter workday. This difference of opinion between workers and employers often resulted in strikes, and sometimes spread beyond one workplace to an entire industry or even an entire city. As early as 1835, working people in America organized general strikes. Not entirely unknown in United States history, general strikes are nonetheless hard to come by. A mere dozen or so citywide general strikes have occurred since the first one in Philadelphia in 1835, and national general strikes have usually appeared only within the confines of a single industry. This is in contrast to the generalized work stoppages that from time to time scare the hell out of ruling classes in other countries. In late May 1835, coal heavers on the Philadelphia docks went on strike for a 10-hour day. Here's how one historian described events. As they paraded down the streets of the city on June 3rd, cordwainers, carpenters, and other tradesmen followed with the shouts of, "We are all-day laborers." Throughout the week, leaders of the recently formed General Trades Union used labor presses, posters, and parades complete with drum and fife corps demanding a 10-hour day to rally Philadelphia workers to join their brethren in the fight. By June 10th, over 40 trades and nearly 20,000 workers, including city employees, joined the strike. Shortly after city workers struck, the city council announced that workers employed under the authority of the city corporation would be granted a 10-hour day. By the end of June, most laborers received the concessions they asked for, and membership in the GTU soared. Thanks to events like this, by 1867, the movement for an 8-hour day had taken hold of the imagination of working people. They had a slogan, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will. But things didn't just move forward. Then, as today, economic hard times would reverse the workers' movement's victories. Just as one example, here in California, unions presented the state legislature with tens of thousands of signatures on a petition for an 8-hour day. And there were demonstrations and strikes for the goal in towns and cities across the state. In February 1868, the governor signed an 8-hour day law, just the second in the country. But after completion of the Transcontinental Railroad the following year and the onset of a national economic depression a couple years after that, California workers lost the 8-hour day because desperate workers flooded in from elsewhere in the country, willing to work for 10 or more hours at the same pay. Also around this time occurred the first large, if unsuccessful, demonstrations and strikes on May 1st for the 8-hour day in Chicago. The governor of Illinois had signed the first statewide 8-hour day law in the country on March 1st, 1867, meant to go in effect on May 1st. It included an unfortunate exception. It would only apply in workplaces where there's, quote, no special contract to the contrary, unquote. This loophole undermined the impact of the law. Although 10,000 workers paraded in support of an effective law, and in many large factories the following day, workers simply walked out after 8 hours, the employers prevailed and the law was not enforced. The push for an 8-hour day was not arbitrary. One of the leaders of the movement, machinist Ira Stewart, said that workers were usually too modest and meek in their behavior and their desires. And the reason was that people who worked 12 or 14 hours a day, 6 or 7 days a week, could only think of eating and sleeping. They didn't have the energy or imagination to dream of a better world, let alone demand it or act together to achieve it. Across the Atlantic, Karl Marx, a leader in the small but influential International Workingmen's Association, also known as the First International, agreed. The 8-hour day, he said, was a central goal of the workers' movement and an important step in the direction of socialism. In other words, the demand for the 8-hour day was what we would call a transitional demand, thus was a revolutionary one, and employers as well as workers knew it. And the bosses did everything in their power to prevent it from happening. By the mid-1880s, a large number of workers' organizations, including a new National Federation of Trade Unions, had passed resolutions for an 8-hour day. Some thought local unions should pressure their own employers to grant an 8-hour day, workplace by workplace. Other groups envisioned a legislative approach, attempting to pass laws in city and state governments with the ultimate goal, a national law. Eventually, momentum built for a nationwide general strike that would mark, hoped the organizers, the beginning of the 8-hour day. The Federation of Organized Trades and Labor Unions set May 1st, 1886 as the big day. It attempted to get the largest worker organization, the Knights of Labor, to join in. Although the general strike idea was popular in the ranks of the Knights, its more conservative leaders were not enthusiastic. So the Federation's local councils worked to create alliances with as many groups as possible, including local Knights assemblies. For months in advance of that day, unions and other worker associations spread the word through meetings and demonstrations, flyers, newsletters, and other publications. The coalition effort was strong. Even before May 1st, tens of thousands of workers had been granted an 8-hour day by employers seeking to avoid a fight. A popular song was sung across the country in these meetings. We mean to make things over. We're tired of toil for naught, but bare enough to live on, never an hour for thought. We want to feel the sunshine. We want to smell the flowers. We're sure that God has willed it, and we mean to have 8 hours. We're summoning our forces from shipyard, shop, and mill. 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will. On Mayday, somewhere between 1/3 to 500,000 workers left their workplaces around the country. In many cities, the strikes and demonstrations continued on for days. In New York, 10,000 marched in a torchlight procession and attended a meeting of 20,000 in Union Square, where the future president of the American Federation of Labor, Sam Gompers, predicted that, quote, May 1st would forever be remembered as a second declaration of independence, unquote. In Louisville, Kentucky, Black and white members of the Knights of Labor, ignoring their national leadership, left work and marched together in a parade of 6,000. The Knights' motto was, an injury to one is the concern of all. And in a time of enormous prejudice, many of its local assemblies nonetheless tried to live up to that idea. Although parks in Louisville were off limits to African Americans, the parade ended in National Park with an integrated demonstration. A Black-owned newspaper reported, quote, thus have the knights of labor broken down the walls of prejudice, unquote. The city with the largest disruption to business as usual was Chicago, where around 80,000 strikers turned out, including shutting some of the largest factories. The majority of these workers were immigrants, Polish Catholics, Russian Jews, and Germans who were especially active on the political left, but they came from elsewhere in Europe as well. The McCormick Reaper Works, a gigantic agricultural equipment factory, had already been on strike since February, and the factory was being run by strikebreakers with the assistance of hundreds of Chicago police and armed thugs hired by the company. An 8-hour demonstration was being held on May 3rd by several thousand lumbermen near the factory, when the factory bell signaled the end of the day for the strikebreakers. As they left, the crowd confronted them. After a fight broke out between the demonstrators and the strikebreakers, police fired into the melee, killing one striker instantly, with more dying of their wounds soon after. One of the speakers at the rally and a witness to the police killings was August Spiess, a socialist journalist and leading left-wing member of the Central Labor Council. He ran back to his office and produced a flyer in English and German, calling for a demonstration the next evening at 7:30 in Haymarket Square to protest the police violence. 20,000 copies were distributed the next morning all over town. The hastily called meeting was in competition with several others in nearby neighborhoods, and a rainstorm was gathering, but around 3,000 showed up, filling just part of the large square. Chicago Mayor Carter Harrison left as the rain began to fall. He stopped in at the local police station and told Captain John Bonfield, who had gathered nearly 200 police and was planning to suppress the demonstration, that it was peaceful, winding down due to the rain, and he should send the police back to their precincts. Instead, Bonfield ordered his men to move in and break up the demonstration. By then, there were about an even number of demonstrators and police. As the police moved into the crowd, someone threw a bomb into their midst. One officer was killed and dozens injured. In the confusion, the police opened fire in all directions, killing demonstrators and police alike. The next day, Mayor Harrison declared martial law, and soon hundreds were arrested. Some were union leaders and left-wing activists, and others were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Eventually, all but 8 men were released. These 8 were charged with murder. The 8 radical working-class leaders, 6 of whom were German immigrants, and several of whom were physically absent from Haymarket Square, were chosen not due to any evidence that connected them to the bomb. Indeed, the bomber was never found. What linked the 8 was their effectiveness as organizers in the city's largely immigrant working class. Normal jury selection processes were suspended, and a jury was handpicked for its hostility to trade unionism, socialism, and anarchism. The judge ordered that all 8 were to be tried together in a conspiracy trial. He forbade the defense to clarify any of the men's political beliefs, ordering them only to respond directly to specific points raised by the prosecution, while the prosecution spoke at great length about anarchism and violence. The state's attorney was remarkably candid regarding what this trial was about. He said, "Law is on trial. Anarchy is on trial. These men have been selected, picked out by the grand jury, and indicted because they are the leaders. They are no more guilty than those thousands who followed them. Gentlemen of the jury, convict these men, make examples of them, hang them, and you save our institutions, our society." 7 of the 8 were convicted, 4 were executed, and 1 committed suicide or was murdered in his cell. Like Illinois Governor Peter Altgeld, who pardoned the remaining 3 prisoners a few years later, legal scholars today believe that the trial was a farce. In the historical atmosphere of what became the nation's first employer-orchestrated Red Scare, the movement for the 8-hour day was not entirely halted, but its momentum was greatly slowed. Ultimately, it took more than 50 years before the 8-hour day became part of federal law, with passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 during the New Deal. So how did Mayday become an international workers' holiday? The last quarter of the 19th century saw the growth all over the world of a movement for socialism. The small International Working Men's Association of Karl Marx had been disbanded in 1876. But a new international, founded in Paris in 1889, represented millions of workers due to the rise of large mass political parties of the left, especially in Europe, but also in the US, Canada, and the Third World, dedicated to a transition from capitalism to socialism. In one of its first official acts in response to the travesty of justice in Chicago, the Second Socialist International proclaimed that each May 1st, workers the world over should demonstrate and act, quote, in a manner suited to the conditions in their own country, unquote, to achieve the 8-hour workday. Since that time, most countries in the world established May 1st as International Workers' Day or Labor Day. The governments of these countries mostly didn't do that out of benevolence or their own free will. It was organized movements of workers calling for it and acting in various ways to achieve it, as the Second International said, in a manner suited to the conditions of their own country, that pushed the governments to proclaim May Day as a holiday. This didn't happen here in the United States due to two things: the momentum that developed throughout the 1880s before the events of 1886 for Labor Day on a different date, plus the fears among labor leaders following the Haymarket convictions of being associated with portrayal of anarchism and socialism as violent ideologies by the conservative media and politicians on behalf of the employers. Since a growing number of cities, beginning with New York in 1882, and states, starting with Oregon in 1887, had proclaimed Labor Day in September as a holiday, it seemed simpler and safer to go with that by the time President Grover Cleveland signed it into federal law in 1894. For worried union leaders, Labor Day didn't have the whiff of radicalism associated with May 1st. For government and business leaders, Labor Day in September was seen as an escape valve, letting the working class have its non-radical day off. But the sentiments for a May Day celebration have never gone away either, because there's a very powerful cluster of ideas that emerged out of this history. The movement for the 8-hour day was tied to an idea for a work holiday on May 1st, and also to a general strike to achieve the 8-hour day. You can think about it this way. A work holiday is, in effect, a legal general strike, which is why the pushback has always been so harsh by employers and government. If we go back to the ideas of the 19th century, time off of work can provide the space needed by workers to consider other ways of organizing not only their own time outside work, but reorganizing society itself as well. That's a compelling concept, and it accounts for the attempts, even in the US to this day, to revive the tradition. By the early 20th century, Sam Gompers and the AFL had abandoned May Day in favor of Labor Day. But socialists, the IWW, and later communists continued to promote the holiday. In 1919, in the midst of the Spanish flu pandemic and a Red Scare led by US Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, 20,000 workers demonstrated in Cleveland on May 1st. Here and in many other major cities, demonstrations and marches were met with violent repression by the authorities, who were running scared. This moment represented an international peak of class struggle in the wake of the Russian Revolution. Huge May Day demonstrations and general strikes rocked the capitals and lesser cities of Europe. In Winnipeg, Canada, May Day demonstrations evolved into a weeks-long general strike. Let's briefly take our detour into the common elements of general strikes and some examples. 4 things are usually required: a generalized anger in the working class, a call by worker leadership for a general strike, an organizational structure in place that can carry it out, and a spark. In that same year of 1919, in February, 60,000 workers went on the Seattle general strike, with 100 unions affiliated with the Central Labor Council joining a solidarity walkout in support of shipyard workers who were already out. The general strike lasted a week, during which workers ran the city, teaching themselves that such things could be done. But it ended with what many consider a defeat, with raids of IWW and socialist offices and mass arrests amid a vicious, coordinated, employer and government-led Red Scare. Let's jump to 1934, at the bottom of the Great Depression. May Day drew a couple 100,000 marchers in New York. San Francisco saw smaller demonstrations, but 9 days later, maritime workers went out on a West Coast-wide strike. After 2 participants, Howard Sperry and Nick Bordois were killed by police. The Labor Council called a general strike. The work stoppage brought virtually all industrial and commercial operations of San Francisco to a halt. After this display of determined collective power, maritime workers gained union recognition, substantial increases in wages, and control over their hiring halls. 1 year to the day after the San Francisco strikers were killed, Congress passed the National Labor Relations Act, or NLRA, establishing a national legal mechanism for peaceful workplace conflict resolution. 12 years later, the Oakland General Strike, part of a massive strike wave of industrial workers following World War II, was the last of 6 citywide general strikes in 1946, and the latest our country has produced. A less violent and less conclusive affair than San Francisco's, touched off by women clerks on strike for union recognition in downtown department stores, Conn's and Hastings. It nevertheless led to collective bargaining in the town's retail industry, and ultimately a progressive shift in the city's power relations. The Oakland General Strike, interestingly, did not call itself a general strike. Its leaders called it, quote, a work holiday, unquote. And it had a festive atmosphere, partly due to its occurrence during the holiday season, but also because the ruling class chose not to contest the outcome with armed force in the streets. At various points, it has seemed that the Mayday holiday might reemerge as a realistic worker demand in America. These efforts, less spectacularly but stubbornly, continue to this day, up to and including the call for general strikes in support of Mayday, but also in connection with other movements of resistance with greater contemporary resonance. Recent instances where political forces issued calls for a general strike, such as the massive 2006 Mayday immigrant rights marches and the Occupy Oakland November 2011 Day of Action that commandeered downtown streets, shuttered banks, and closed the port, did not result in the classic general strike scenario of everyone leaving work, but did manage to dent daily routines, make significant statements, and impact public opinion because they were attached to actually existing movements with achievable goals. With such demonstrable results for the tactic, why would progressive forces within labor refrain from calling for a general strike against the Trump agenda, which includes existential threats to unions today? One reason, following the 1946 strike wave, a conservative Congress passed the Taft-Hartley Act over Harry Truman's veto. Among several damaging anti-labor provisions, it imposed limits on and penalties for mass strikes in the public sector, which can result in serious fines and jail sentences for participants. Today's union leaders are painfully aware of this difference between the mid-20th century era of militant action and now. Another difference between 1946 and now is the changed nature of the economy and the workforce. Fewer than 10% of US workers are now employed in manufacturing, the former heart of the labor movement, and the service sector is not as deeply unionized as manufacturing once was. With the shrunken labor movement, working people have been more vulnerable to right-wing look over there, divide and conquer demagogy, blaming immigration, taxes, big government, or, say, teachers, for the country's problems. While slightly more subtle than the propaganda of the capitalist class in the 19th century, the goal remains the same: keep workers suspicious of one another and prevent the unity necessary for effective action. Finally, muscles of class power need exercise to perform properly. Over the decades, as labor's density in the workforce atrophied under relentless assault by capital, so did its capacity to support actions like general strikes. Yet it is unlikely that Taft-Hartley prohibitions would matter much if an energized, united labor movement pulled off a successful general strike. As with labor in the 30s and 40s and the civil rights movement a couple decades later, the sheer scale of such mass civil disobedience would seriously hamper the ability of the government and employers to impose legal penalties. We saw this dynamic play out recently in the wave of public education strikes, where their size intimidated Republican legislatures and governors, and the effort to pass laws imposing jail time in Colorado went nowhere, although it took a second statewide strike in West Virginia last year to beat back an attempt by the legislature to undo what was won the year before. In this atmosphere, at least one left-wing labor leader, Sarah Nelson of the flight attendants, made a credible threat to call a general strike during last year's congressional budget standoff. With the government shut down and TSA workers beginning to call in sick, her threat was deemed credible enough by the Trump administration that it quickly negotiated an end to the standoff. The Trump regime's ugliness has in fact generated various forms of mass direct action, including some of considerable size and scale. The diversity of tactics has included the women's marches, direct action against deportation of immigrants, intensified electoral work to take back Congress and state legislatures from right-wing anti-immigrant and anti-labor politicians and replace them with sane human beings, in addition to the mass strikes in public education, auto, and hotels, not to mention the Bernie campaigns and explosive growth of DSA. And this was before the pandemic hit. This activism is all good practice, but whether we get to a general strike will depend not so much on desire as on the practical readiness of large numbers of workers who understand their own collective power and a mature organizational center to harness and channel that energy effectively. It is ironic that the events that gave birth to Mayday occurred in 1886, the same year as the United States received the gift of the Statue of Liberty from France. A symbol of welcome to immigrants was dedicated as a wave of xenophobia and anti-immigrant scapegoating swept the nation, set in motion through a successful effort by anti-labor forces to hold the line against the 8-hour day. This cluster of contradictions is more the norm than not and continues to the present day. So which will it be? Divide and conquer or unite and win? In the midst of the current pandemic, the outlines of the future are somewhat blurrier than usual. But here's a curious idea. Thanks to the needs of public health, we have watched a more extensive shutdown of the economy take place than we've seen since the Great Depression, and perhaps it will be much worse than that by the time it's over. With tens of millions not working, if you squint your eyes, what we're looking at is an inadvertent visual of a general strike. Of course, a real general strike is quite intentional on the part of the working class, and that's not what's happening. But here's what's similar. Enforced idleness for millions of working people, a situation rightly feared by 19th century capitalist ideologues as the devil's workshop, in which workers might have some time to ponder their situation and the society in which they live and come up with some criticisms, actions, and proposals for a different way of organizing our lives. Some of this is in fact happening. On the one hand, on the ground, we're seeing a significant uptick in action. Demonstrations and walkouts by frontline workers demanding safe workplaces during the pandemic. Hundreds of small but noisy strikes at fast food restaurants, factories, delivery services, hospitals, and especially in the global supply chain have been bubbling up in the last few months. There's been an outpouring of affection and support for these workers as the public encounters them in hospitals, supermarkets, at the door of their homes, and in the streets, and renewed appreciation for their essential work. On the other hand, with much of industry shut down, roads free of cars, clear blue skies, saying hello to your neighbors as you take 7 walks a day, there are hints of other ways of doing things. Like me, you've probably seen numerous articles, and not just on Jacobin, about how the shelter in place has not been all bad, how it opens up the imagination to contemplation of other social possibilities. I've been hearing similar thoughts on podcasts and conversations and in interminable Zoom meetings. Tomorrow is Mayday 2020, and in it we are seeing the kinds of creativity, mobilization, and anger and numbers typical of mass people's movements beginning to germinate. The question is how these building blocks of change, collective action, public support for workers, and imagining a better world can be pulled together and amplified and nourished during the crisis in which we find ourselves. That's another way of asking whether we can organize more effectively than Trump and the capitalist class. The history of Mayday, with its ebb and flow of connection between labor and socialism, reform struggles and revolutionary ideas, repression and resistance, tells us that this is far from easy, but that it's possible. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you out in the streets.